This is my fiddle that I made, and I don't know of anything that I've ever done that has been so much fun. I had no history of any woodworking or using tools or anything. I read an article in a series of books called Foxfire, and it described making a mountain fiddle. And I became obsessed that I wanted to make a violin. Now, I couldn't play the violin. I briefly had lessons as a child, and I was just absolutely terrible and just hated every minute of it. But I read everything I could on making a violin and on different woods. And I read for about 6 months, and then I just started in. And I made it just in the classical way. It's the front and the back are hollowed out like a turtle shell. There are 2 pieces of wood joined together, and I got a good tight seam on both. I did this with hand tools, with a hand plane. I inlaid this little line which is called purfling, which is one way you can tell a good violin from a bad one. The cheap violins just have that painted in. The good violins have it inlaid. Now, mine's a very amateurish, but at any rate, I did everything. I bent the sides over actually a hot soldering iron and carved the scroll out myself. I took lessons on fiddling, and then when my wife got ill, I kind of gave those up, and so I've never really learned how. But I thoroughly enjoyed making the violin. I intended to make another one after I retired, and I got started, but never had the drive I did with the first one. Okay, I came from this small town in Missouri, a little town named Pleasant Hill, about 30 miles southeast of Kansas City. It's now being swallowed up and has almost become a suburb of Kansas City, and incidentally a pretty nice suburb. I've seen some of the houses the last time I was back several years ago, and it's a good part of Kansas City that's expanded. At any rate, at the time I grew up, Missouri was still a segregated state. Missouri had been a slave state during the Civil War, and the settlers had mostly come from Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and it still had very much of a Southern mentality. My hometown had a lynching in 1915, which was before I was born and before my family lived in Pleasant Hill. And it was kept very secret. Two men robbed the local depot, and the night watchman shot it out with them, killed one of them, and the other one killed him. And they caught the man that killed the night watchman and locked him up in the city jail. When they came down to open up the jail the next day, the guy who had the killer was hanging from a bell tower behind the jail. He had been lynched. This story was kept very quiet. Nobody mentioned who was in on this. I heard stories from people who were living there at the time or older than I. The one guy that I knew was a little boy, and he said this had happened in wintertime. And he said the town was very quiet. The streets were deserted, but you could hear wagons coming into town from the country, from all directions. And somebody came to his father's house and knocked on the door and said, "Do you want to come with us tonight? We're having a little necktie party." And the father said, "No, I'd rather not." At any rate, nobody knew who had participated in this. It always seemed to me to be pretty good justice. Number one, they caught the guy literally with the smoking gun. They were going to make sure that some fancy big city lawyer from Kansas City didn't come out and get him off or get him with some light sentence. And I think he was probably somewhat related to most of the Tennesseans in my hometown. At any rate, I later found out from one of the town drunks who I was talking to about certain people in the community who had participated in the lynching, and that a local judge had actually, who I knew very well and was a very nice person, had presided over this. And the guy to be lynched said, "Could I see my wife before they hang me?" And the response was, "You didn't let so-and-so see his wife." The bell tower stood for years behind the jail. And when I was a kid on Halloween, we would climb up and ring the bell. Now, even though the rope was gone, it was really dangerous when I look back on it that we did this. But that was very spooky, and we thought befitting Halloween. And during World War II, they scrapped the bell tower and the bell both. Everybody has the concept that the old days were always the good old days, and that the small town encompassed all the virtues of America and the good old days. Now, there is some truth to this. There were good things about being raised in a small town. We certainly were free to roam and get out into the woods and be on our own and fish and hunt. It was also, it was a bad time. There weren't the social services. There was a boy that was actually in my brother's class in grammar school, 3 years older than I was, who was born with a hair lip and a cleft palate. His mother had a hair lip and a cleft palate and was a very fundamentalistic religious person. A group of women in my hometown had raised some money to send this boy to Mercy Hospital in Kansas City to have surgery for this cleft palate and hair lip. The mother said no, that if God had wanted him any different, he would have made him different. So this boy grew up and went through grammar school with a cleft palate, hair lip, and the speech impediment went with it. In fitting with the times, this is when they called mental hospitals insane asylums, and every county had a poor farm. He had a nickname of Oinky Thomas because he spoke like that. he was the subject of teasing, and you can imagine going through grammar school with that sort of a situation. At any rate, Oinky turned bad. Not mean and not criminal, not violent, but he stuck up some local, I don't know, store, filling station, what have you. He had a mask over his face, a handkerchief. But he went in and said, "Here, come on," and was immediately identified and picked up. And I've always thought about this of the good old days, of really how cruel the world could be. That after all, whether we like it or not, we are our brother's keepers. Kansas City had the Playmore Ballroom, and most of the big name bands went through there at one time or another. And I saw both Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey at the Playmore. They were probably the biggest names I saw at the Playmore. I saw Glenn Miller do a radio broadcast from Kansas City. And those were sort of the celebrities I saw. I passed General Eisenhower about 2 days after I was inducted into the Army and didn't know how to salute yet. I was carrying a bundle of papers, so I put both hands under the bundle of papers. I knew that excused you from saluting, and walked by Eisenhower. I did not see President Roosevelt, but had an experience that I sent to the Roosevelt archives at Hyde Park. When I was in my senior year in high school, this would, I think, have been about autumn of 1944. We got word that Roosevelt's train was coming through my hometown. My hometown was on the main line of the Missouri Pacific Railroad. They let school out. The entire town flocked down to the depot to see Roosevelt. Now, this section of Missouri at that time was very strongly Democratic and had supported Roosevelt overwhelmingly. We hoped that we would get a glimpse of Roosevelt and that maybe he might even step out on the rear car and say a few words. The Army sent in a group of soldiers. They set up a machine gun on the platform at the depot, and they entertained the crowd by doing close order drill. We were high school students. We were absolutely delighted with all of this. The train came through and stopped to take on water. The blinds were drawn. No Roosevelt. Nobody came out. But down at the far end of the car, off in the distance, we saw a little black Scotty dog get off with an attendant. The dog proceeded to take a pee and got back on the train, and the train pulled out. So I didn't see Roosevelt, but Fowler took a pee in my hometown. Now the town was we felt a little bit flattered even at that. We didn't get to see Roosevelt, but Fowler peed in the hometown. I sent this story, which is absolute gospel. I sent this to the Roosevelt Archives in Hyde Park because I thought the story will die when I die. And it really was a sideline that was certainly interesting to me. Prohibition was enacted as a constitutional amendment in this country in 1919 or 1920. And this prohibited the sale of all alcohol, except the medical use of alcohol. And alcohol was felt to be a medicine and was obtainable by prescription. Now, many a doctor made an extra buck by writing out a prescription for spiritus frumenti. And as a matter of fact, when I was in medical school on Sundays, Missouri had blue laws. And the only way you could buy alcohol was by prescription. And I would write a prescription for spiritus frumenti. And the directions were 1 teaspoonful every telephone pole. This would be typed out by the pharmacist and would be stuck on the label. And nobody ever questioned it or said you shouldn't do this or it's illegal. At any rate, everything was drunk by everybody. We saw things when I was in medical school called the Jake leg. The Jake leg was a neurologic disorder that you got from drinking Jamaica ginger. And we had a guy in my hometown whose nickname was Vanilla Dunham because he drank vanilla extract, which contained alcohol. There are 2 people that I've known in my lifetime that were real killers. One actually was a person from my hometown who was a killer. He and another compatriot killed a farmer and his 17-year-old son a few miles outside of my hometown. At any rate, the other one was a person that I knew in the Army who had just gotten out of the Army prisons. Among other things, he had been in Litchfield Prison. Litchfield Prison was a notorious Army prison in Scotland, set up in World War II, that was brought to light by a writer named Robert Rourke. And whether this fellow that I knew, whose name was Henderson, had ever been in Litchfield Prison or not, I don't know. At any rate, he was absolutely the scariest person I have ever known, and I think a complete psychopath. He got out of prison and came into the outfit I was in, which was really just waiting to ship out after finishing basic training. Everybody was frightened of him. He was totally fearless. He had been a paratrooper, and his story was that he had been put in prison because he stole a ham and sold it on the black market. Nobody believed that because nobody was sent to Litchfield for stealing a ham. At any rate, he was totally fearless, totally psychopathic. For some reason which I could never explain, he hated everybody except a Polish boy named Kubiak and myself. There was certainly nothing I ever did to curry favor with this guy, nor did I think Kubiak. But for some reason, this guy liked me and liked Kubiak. Kubiak even went to the point of teasing him, which I held in horror. I would never have dreamt of doing. To illustrate this guy's personality, one Sunday, we're sitting around on a lazy Sunday afternoon, and people are taking naps on their bunks, or they're playing cards, or what have you. There were 2 guys that had had a little bit to drink, and they're out arguing about something in the company street. they're really not creating much of a disturbance. But Henderson said, I had enough of this, jumped up off of his bunk and went out and hit this one guy on the point of his chin and knocked him completely unconscious and spread-eagled out in the company street. I had never seen anything like this before. And it was over this minor thing. Henderson went AWOL. His hometown was Washington, D.C. He came back a few days later, and in the middle of the night, I'm up on my top bunk, sound asleep, and I'm awakened by Henderson shaking me, saying, "Wake up, Clay, wake up. You should have seen what I did to that bitch. Boy, I really fixed her." Henderson has gone back to see his wife, and apparently has beat the hell out of her. He's covered with blood. I'm 18 years old. He's shaking me awake in the middle of the night. I could feel the hair on the back of my head standing on edge. I have never known anybody like that, and I hope I never do again. As I said, I think Henderson liked me. On the other hand, I think if Henderson had felt the least bit offended, he wouldn't have hesitated to have killed me along with anyone else. When I was in medical school, we had a preceptorship program. On our off quarter of our senior year, we were sent out to somebody in general practice in a rural area in Kansas. And I was out with a guy that had been out of internship only a couple of years. He was very conscientious and very good. And we got along very well. He was very reluctant to feel that anybody was in any way a neurotic. He would say, "What do you think about so-and-so?" And I would say, "I think he or she is probably a little bit crocky," which was our term. And he said, "Well, I kind of do too, and I don't know." It turns out, not long after he had started practice, one of the aides that worked in the local small 12-bed hospital, one of the people that used to stop him out in the hall when he was trying to make rounds and ask him about, "I've been having a pain here and a pain there and this and that," and was really considered a neurotic, was beginning to have vague complaints of weakness and complaints that he could find no basis for. And he'd get called at odd hours about these complaints. This one day he got called over to her house, and she was having trouble walking. He's in the bedroom examining her. The door's open. Her family's sitting in the living room, hearing everything that's going on. He said he examined her. He couldn't find anything. She said she couldn't walk. He said he finally just had it. And he said, "There's nothing wrong with you. You could walk if you just would." And he said she looked at me, and she rolled back her eyes, and she just died right at that moment. And I said, "Oh, good Lord, what did you do?" I said, "I'd have gone out the back window and I'd still be running." And he said, "Well," I said, "how did the family?" He said, "They were fine." He said, "They still come to me." He said, "I think they were kind of glad to get rid of her." I encountered, although I didn't take training in obstetrics other than what I had an internship, I encountered some peculiar obstetrical situations. When I was in my preceptorship, out by myself. The doctor was out on a call. I did a breech delivery on the local dentist's wife. I had never done a breech delivery, nor had I ever seen a breech delivery. And that's about the most lonesome I have ever felt. The baby came out, everything was fine except the baby wasn't breathing. And I thought, I've killed my first one already and I haven't even finished medical school. And I put a tracheal cannula down somewhere and suctioned out, and the baby breathed and all was right with the world. And I survived that. And I was in residency and a cab pulled up to the emergency room door. And this woman jumps out of the cab screaming something about her sister, drags a bloody towel out with her as she gets out of the cab door. The cab driver knows nothing about anything. I'm looking in the back of this dark cab. I get a flashlight, and there's a woman sprawled out on the back seat. I'm trying to find where the bleeding has come from. And I pull her panties down to examine her abdomen, and here is a head looking out at me. She's delivering in the back seat of the cab. And all I had to do was get a towel and catch the baby. But this is my delivery in a cab. Is that okay? Okay. When I was in residency, I had this very cantankerous patient. He had heart trouble and had been in some heart failure. And actually, we got him bailed out. We got his heart compensated, and he was breathing better and probably was in better shape than he had been for the last 5 or 6 years. He just complained about everything. He did not feel any gratitude, which we felt we were entitled to. At any rate, he was getting a medication to control the fluid retention from his heart failure, a medication called thiomarin, which was an injection. And it's an old medicine that's no longer used. But at any rate, it was state of the art at that time. One of the nurses came up to me this one day and said, I made a mistake on Mr. So-and-so. Instead of giving him 2 cc's of thiomarin, I gave him 2 cc's of thiamine. Thiamine is vitamin B1. And I thought, well, there's no harm from that. Go ahead. Give him his thiomarin. It won't. He had a terrible allergic reaction to the thiamine, which I've only seen once since, nothing this bad. He became one big hive, and his hair, which had been very thinning and gray, fell out in just swaths. But when his hair began to come back, it came back thicker and darker than it had been before the shot. He was overjoyed. He thought I had given him a shot to grow hair, and he thought I was the greatest doctor in the world. Now, you learn to take the bitter with the better. You take enough blame for things that you haven't done that you learn that you're not going to disenchant somebody who may be crediting you with something that you don't deserve. In other words, if he wants to think you're the greatest doctor in the world, why try to dissuade him from that? But he thought, he said, what is that medicine that you gave me for my hair? And I said, oh, it's a little something we've been working on here. Okay, this is a story called The Schedule from Hell. I didn't give it this name. The staff that worked at my office did. And this story is well known amongst the medical community, including people who weren't even working in medical offices at the time I retired. Everybody, they've all heard about this. As with anything, doctors have patients that they enjoy seeing and others that they don't particularly enjoy seeing. Now, there are many reasons. The people that the doctor doesn't particularly want to see on his schedule may be a very nice person, but it may be a person who simply wants to go over everything that ever happened to them in a lifetime during an office visit. And of course, you have to make order out of chaos. You can only allot, you have a certain amount of time to allot and a certain number of patients you have to see, and you have to sense the urgency and the importance and the amount of time needed. And the patient from hell doesn't seem to fit in to this slot. I read once a doctor said, the last thing a patient complains about is what really brought them in to see you. And I had that illustrated with one. I remember a woman that came in with complaints of many minor things, a minor rash, a little backache, this. I'm actually have finished with her, have gone through her complaints. She's getting ready to walk out of the office and says, I think I feel something in my breast. I check her breast and here is an obvious cancer. It has all the field. This was the thing that brought her in to see me and illustrated that adage very well. At any rate, we all had patients that we dreaded to see on the schedule. And you did the best you could. The patients were very often very nice people. It had nothing to do with this. It was the way of handling it, and some of this may have been your inadequacies of handling it. At any rate, this one day, I had the schedule. The girls always had the times written out. The patients were in slots, such and such a patient for such and such a time. And if they were scheduled for a more thorough or a more complete exam, extra time was allotted. Now, the schedule couldn't be gospel. You had to allow your staff certain leeway. And unfortunately, some doctor staffs never do that. I mean, it is gospel. They won't put anybody in if the schedule's full, no matter how dire the problem sounds. I tried not to do that. But at any rate, this one day, I walked in and the schedule was full. Not only was it full, but everybody who came in and wanted to go over their life history and tell you every food that had disagreed with them from the time they were 15 years old and about what their last bowel movements had been for the last 10 years was on the schedule. And I thought, well, it's one of these days. Let's get started, might as well get. And I started in, and I'm seeing patients, but I'm not seeing anybody on this list. And this was one of the things that always infuriated me. When the girls would add patients and tell them to come in, but wouldn't put it down on the list. This was done not infrequently. For instance, if I had to get away from the office early, and I would say, now, I've got to get out of here early. I've got to go to the hospital. I've got to do this. I've got to do that. Don't put anybody in after 4 o'clock. They would very faithfully follow that, except they'd have 4 people scheduled to come in at 3:45. So I'm seeing all of these people, none of whom are on the schedule, and I'm just furious. And I went in and slammed down on the desk and said, what is going on? This just has nothing to do with reality. None of the people I'm seeing are on this list, and I've still got all this to go through. And they said, April Fool. It was the 1st of April, and I bit on it, and the word was passed around. The girls still talk about it, and people that I've never known, people that I haven't the faintest idea who they are, all know about the schedule from hell. This is perhaps not the best story in regards to doctor-patient relationships, and one that I wouldn't do today. But I was young and early in my practice, and people had a little different mentality. We had a thing called a backup panel. This was before we had a full-time emergency room staff. And they would, at the emergency room, would call on doctors in rotation on patients showing up with various problems. And I got this kid, about 17, who was hopped up higher than a kite on Jimson weed. Jimson weed contains scopolamine, and they get what we call a scope jag. And he was hyperactive all over the place, and with a very attentive mother who was probably about 3/4 of his problems. As I attempted to examine him, he tried to bite me on the hand. This was during the hippie era, he had the long hippie hair. I grabbed a lock of the long hippie hair and proceeded to rap his head against the examining table a few times, which had an amazing calming effect on him, but not his mother. His mother seized him up and clasped him to her bosom and took him out of the emergency room, which solved the problem for me. I don't know what ever happened to him. This is my tapeworm story. Actually, one of the girls that worked for me at the time was out, came to see me just a few days ago. At any rate, I had this patient who was Japanese American. He was still very much oriented toward Japan. He had a Japanese wife who did not speak English. He spent considerable amounts of time in Japan. He came into my office this one day and said he had been passing threads of white threads in his stools. And I had a stool specimen analyzed, and it showed tapeworm eggs. Now, a new medicine had just come out for treating tapeworm, and it was much less cumbersome. Before that, you had to examine. There were medications to eradicate the tapeworm, but if the head of the tapeworm remained intact, and attached to the bow wall, then the tapeworm regenerated again. The tapeworm was really built for survival. Each segment of a tapeworm was both male and female. It had male sex organs, female sex organs, and could impregnate itself in each segment. So you can imagine the survivability of an organism like this. And before this new medication, you had to go through that entire segment, or whatever segments of the tapeworm had been passed, and look for the head. But this new medication dissolved the head, was a single shot treatment. It was not commercially available, but it was available only through the health department, the U.S. Public Health Service in Atlanta. So I got on the telephone and spent a considerable amount of time with the health service, public health service, and I had to, among other things, promise them that I would personally supervise the administration of this medication so that they knew that the patient got it and that I had to report what had happened. Okay, patient came in on Tuesday and we had received the medication from Atlanta and we gave it to him. I told him to save anything that he passed in his stools and to bring it in. Okay, the next day is Wednesday. And I took Wednesday, either the whole day or the afternoon off at that time. I usually did paperwork, and I picked up on odds and ends. And my wife knew where I was. I might get a haircut, or I might do this or that. This one Wednesday, however, I was out of touch. I'd gone to a bookstore, and I was out of touch with the telephone. And when I came home, Marilyn was absolutely frantic. She said, "Where have you been? I don't know what's going on down at the office. The girls sound hysterical. They're just frantic. They've been calling and calling and calling." And my first thought was, my God, somebody's had a heart attack and died in the office. So I didn't even call. I just drove down to my office as fast as I could. Here is the patient with the tapeworm, standing in the middle of the waiting room with a paper plate that looks like it's piled high with spaghetti. This is a tapeworm that I had estimated must be at least 30 feet long. The girls are all up against the walls as though somebody is holding a gun on them. And nobody wants to get near this tapeworm. So I took the tapeworm, I went to the hospital lab, and I got a formalin solution and put the tapeworm in it and brought it home. Now, my youngest son, James, who's taping this, was very curious and very interested in biology and nature in general. And when I explained this to James with the tapeworm, he became just totally fascinated. Kept it in his room, carried it with him wherever he went, including to the dining table. Marilyn said, "I can't take this anymore. You've got to get rid of this tapeworm." So I thought, where can I find a good home for the tapeworm? And Jim Morrow, who is biology teacher at the local community college, Allen Hancock College, an excellent teacher and a very, very good biologist. I asked him, would you like to have a tapeworm for your collection? And he was just overjoyed. He took the tapeworm in. I thought, it's found a good home. He had it for years and years and years. And finally, it just dissolved. And Jim said, I don't have it anymore. You got to get me another tapeworm. But I've never encountered another one since. Okay. This chess set I carved myself. I didn't make the board, but I carved the pieces. The white pieces are basswood, which is a very fine grained and yet not too hard wood. It's beautiful wood to work with. This is the wood that the German wood carvers in the Middle Ages used. I would say rather than carved, I whittled it. I'm not a carver, I'm a whittler. And I would whittle this, I have no idea how many hours. I'd whittle in the evenings as I came home to relax and I'm watching television. The dark pieces are mahogany, which also is an easy wood to work with. It's more porous. It's not as fine grained, and you can't get the fine detail that you can with basswood. This is a copy of a Viking set that was found. It dates from about, I think about 1100